right, so one of the things we had talked about previously was why do we have the traits that we do? So, like, I mentioned, why do I have my facial hair that doesn't connect? Why is my hair the color that it is? Why are my eyes the color that they are? And we learned about how that's linked to the actual chromosomes that we inherit from our parents and the way that gets passed down and the probability involved in determining the traits of offspring. But one thing you may have noticed just by looking at people is that some traits are much more prevalent in men than they are in women. And so that's what I wanted to take a look at today is why are some traits linked to our biological sex? And to do this, I wanted to share with you one of the scariest traits that most men and boys think about throughout the course of their entire life. That's right. We are talking about male pattern baldness. Just thinking about it freaks you out a little bit, right? And this is something that we all fear is like, what happens if I lose my hair? How am I going to do this? Am I going to go with a comb over? Or am I just going to accept it and fully lose it all? But as much as the boys may be scared, I wanted to share with you girls, it's also possible for you too. Women can go bald, but you may have noticed by looking around, women tend to go bald much less often than men. There's also another trait that we should maybe take a look at, and that is to do with this. If you're looking at this, what I want you to see is, do you notice any pattern that's actually in here? If you do, great. That's totally awesome. If you don't see anything except a whole bunch of dots right now with no pattern actually on the inside of them, I'm sorry to say this, but you might be colorblind. Specifically red-green colorblind. You see in here there is actually written the number 74, and it's written with a different color, written with green dots and surrounded with red dots. For those people who are red-green colorblind, they have a lot of trouble distinguishing between these two different colors. And so when they look at this, it literally looks like it is all just red dots. That being said, for people who are red-green colorblind, if you were to take a look at the percentages, what you would find is that men are colorblind much, much more often than women. It is actually quite rare for a woman to be red-green colorblind, whereas for men, red-green colorblindness is not something that is really uncommon. Why is this? Why are some traits much more prevalent in men than they are in women? Well, this would be why. It has to do with these two sets of chromosomes. Remember, the last set of chromosomes are what we call the sex chromosomes. They determine your biological sex. And what you'll notice by looking at these is that the X chromosome is much, much bigger than the Y chromosome. So that means the X chromosome is actually carrying more information than the Y chromosome, which means that some traits can be carried on the X chromosome that aren't carried on the Y chromosome. So why does this ultimately lead to men having these traits? Well, if a trait is recessive, it means that a woman would have to inherit two of those recessive traits. For a man, it means you actually only need to inherit one recessive gene because the Y doesn't carry any information. So then the X, with its recessive gene, would be what displays the trait for that man. And that is ultimately what we call a sex-linked trait. Colorblindness is a great example. It is a sex-linked trait. So here's what we're going to do is we're going to work through an example so that you can see how we deal with sex-linked traits and the way that they actually work. And so this is what we're going to do. We are going to look at fruit flies, a classic example when it comes to genetics problems. Fruit flies don't have a lot of chromosomes. They tend to be studied quite heavily, and we're able to use them to figure out lots about the ways that things work inside of chromosomes. But in fruit flies, they also have eye colors that are determined by their sex. And so it tells us here, in fruit flies, eye color is a sex-linked trait. Now, what I probably should have included in here is that this is carried on the X chromosome. Now, what we can figure out by reading this is that red eyes are dominant, white eyes are recessive. It tells us next that a red-eyed male breeds with a white-eyed female. What would be the expected genotypic and phenotypic ratios? Okay, let's think back to how we solve genetics problems. When we solve genetics problems, remember I showed you all the steps in the last video. So the first step is determine your parents' genotypes. Genotypes are going to be a little bit different because we're talking about things carried on the X chromosome. So for the male, let's take a look at his genotype very first. The way that we often would do this is we, first of all, actually write out X and Y. Because it is a male fruit fly, he has one X chromosome, one Y chromosome. He has red eyes, which is the dominant trait. So what we end up doing is we put the genotype as superscript. And so I'm going to use E for eyes. He has a dominant trait, so capital E. And this is carried on the X chromosome. So the X chromosome that he has the dominant trait. The Y chromosome doesn't have anything. And that's because the Y chromosome doesn't actually carry this trait at all. So then let's figure out the female. Now, females do not have XY, they have XX. Now, the female has white eyes, which means that she is carrying two recessive genes or two recessive alleles. So she has two lowercase letters as subscript. So what we're saying is on one of her X chromosomes, lowercase, on the other X chromosome, lowercase. So now let's think back to what I had you do before. What I had you do before was figure out your Punnett square. So draw your Punnett square, draw a line through the middle, draw a line through the top. Let's move our chromosomes and split them apart. So X capital E from the male here, Y over here, X lowercase e over here, X lowercase e over here. Don't worry about that, that's a coffee stain. I spilled my coffee, sorry. I know it looks gross, but it's just some coffee. It'll be okay. Saving paper, saving the world, the environment. You're welcome. Okay, now what we do is we combine. So we're gonna combine these things together into our Punnett square. So X capital E, X lowercase e. Remember, write the capital first because it is dominant and so it will overshadow the recessive chromosome. We get the same thing over here. Now, for these ones, these are going to be XYs, and all of the X's are going to be carried from the mother. Okay, so then let's figure out the ratios. So what I mean by ratios is I mean that we should actually look at what are the total possibilities, essentially what is the theoretical probability for the different outcomes that we can have. So let's figure this out. If we are taking a look at the genotypes, well, there are two possible genotypes. There is X, E, X, E. There is a 2 out of 4 or a 50% chance that someone born from these parents would have that genotype. If someone were to have this genotype, there is a 2 out of 4 chance, or 50%. For our phenotypes, that's a little bit different here. So for phenotypes, that's your physical traits. Now the first thing is these would have red eyes, but a part of this is that they're female. You have a 50% chance of being a red-eyed female, and you have a 50% chance of being a white-eyed male. Hopefully you could also see if you were a male born from these parents, you have a 100% chance of developing white eyes. If you were a female, you have a 100% chance of developing red eyes. And so let's think back to the traits that we talked about. For men, when it comes to their sex-linked traits, things like colorblindness, they inherit that purely from their mother. So their mother can have normal vision and not be colorblind, but can carry the trait for colorblindness and then pass that down to her male offspring. So for men, you have like a 50% chance in that case. And your chances are just much higher because you only carry the one X chromosome. For women, you actually get half of your sex-linked traits from your mother and half from your father, whereas men get all of their sex-linked traits from their mother's X chromosome. And this is what we call sex-linked traits. Sex-linked traits determine our all sorts of different things, and it also explains why men and women end up having different traits and different ratios of traits as we start to explore some of the things in the biological world. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully you can get a little bit of practice working through some Punnett squares related to sex-linked traits. If you have any questions, make sure you ask, and thanks for watching.